walk in and sit, and that's fine. Are we filming already?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. Welcome, and especially welcome to Dr. Wail Hassan, who so kindly accepted to sit with us today and talk about his work, particularly his relationship with translation and translation issues, and then the article that we discussed in the reading group the most, the South-South dialogue, Alberto Mussa. So he'll talk for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor up and we can have questions and, you know, take this opportunity and ask and think about your own projects and be kind enough to help you through it and to give you advice. Okay?
Thank you, Maya. It's really a big thrill for me to be here, and thanks for coming this morning too. I think I'll just try to limit my remarks to maybe highlighting the 4 or 5 points that I think are the most relevant to translation in the material that I sent you. It's things that, as I sat down and tried to do my homework yesterday and reread these things that I sent you also, and abstract from them what do I think about translation based on what I've already written. And it's not something, of course these are things that were written at different times for different purposes, and I never really sat down and said, here is what I think of translation, but bits and pieces came in each one of these essays as they were written. So this is my attempt to just kind of synthesize them somehow, and I think that there's probably 4 points which seem to me at this point to be really what I think, if that makes any sense. So the first is that all translation is cultural. Right? When we say translation, I mean we talk about cultural translation. That's a term that I've used especially in the book Humanities. But I think I wouldn't want to say that there is cultural translation as one type of translation, and then other kinds of translation which are not culture. I think I'm more inclined now to believe that all translation is cultural, in the sense that, especially when we're translating between languages, we are crossing cultural boundaries at the same time that we're crossing linguistic boundaries. But I would go even further and say, even when we're translating within the same society, or within the same tradition, that is also a cultural translation. How many of us can read Chaucer, for instance, in Middle English? Right? So when we read Chaucer in contemporary English, that is an act of translation, and it's cultural, because 14th century England is not the England that we now and we know. So that's a cultural translation within the same culture, simply because there's a lapse of several centuries. I mean, the only kind of exception that I might see to this is, like, say, if you're going from speech to sign language. Both are contemporary, but even there, some people would argue that the deaf have their own culture, in the sense. I mean, that's kind of a different notion of culture here, more narrowly as a kind of a group of people who share a certain predicament and a certain idiom that distinguishes a certain minority, we might say, and that also, even in that kind of translation, which is between 2 contemporary idioms within the same society, that also involves certain cultural translations. So I would say then, the question of cultural barriers are there in every kind of translation. So that would be, and of course it's much more obvious when we're talking about say Arabic and English or French or these more clearly sort of cross-cultural transactions. So this would be the first thing. The second thing I would say that all translation is therefore also ideological. All right, in the sense that probably in more than one sense. Every text is a product of a certain time, is authored by one person, at least when we can identify an author. If we can't identify an author, the 1001 Nights, then it probably took shape over a period of time, and different ideological formations went into the making of it, right? But when we are translating that today, there, then we are certainly doing that from a certain ideological perspective as well. Okay? Consciously or unconsciously. Most often I would say unconsciously. Okay? But we're never really free of ideology. So therefore any kind of translation is a product of the ideology of the translator. And the question then becomes, well, there are many questions. What is that ideological need that makes us, first of all, choose what text to translate? This is not a free choice. The strategies that we choose to translate something, and again, there can be any number of degrees of awareness of that strategy. I mean, I might think that I'm translating something directly and being as faithful as possible, but you know, I think research now shows that all the choices that seem to be natural are also always motivated, right, and interested in all sorts of ways. So I would say all of that is ideological. Two, when you're translating poetry, for instance, I mean, do I translate? How do I deal with the prosody of it? I mean, how do I deal with the rhyme scheme? How do I deal with form? How do I translate a sonnet? I mean, we don't have the sonnet in Arabic, for instance, right? How do I deal with the rhyme scheme? Well, these are all kind of decisions that are made, and they involve choices based on a certain understanding of what it is that I'm doing and who am I doing this for, right? And what kind of task is this translation going to perform for my reader? And all of that, I think, has an ideological subtext to it. So I would also say, and I guess the third point, that all translations answer to local concerns. Questions of identity are always involved in it. Precisely because there is decontextualization, and you take text out of its own context, out of its own tradition, and then putting it into English. I'll just give you an example. I mean, I've translated 2 books only so far, and I never before that thought of myself as a translator at all. But when I started reading this book by Abdel Fattah Khalif, that I picked up at the bookstore in downtown Cairo, and just because the title sounded interesting, and I started reading it, and before I got through chapter 3, and it's a short book, I realized this is a book that I have to translate. And I have to translate it because, not because it is addressing important questions in Arabic literature, intellectual history, which is what Khalif set out to do in that book, but because it can be a meaningful intervention in questions that I'm thinking about as far as debates on translation and world literature and what comparative literature does in the United States. So it was my being immersed in that other context that made me want to pick this particular text and say, I have to translate that. Right? So it was not an innocent choice by any means. It was a choice that is motivated by an investment in a particular local context, which for me was the U.S. academic context at a time when translation debates were kind of taking over the discipline of comparative literature. And I thought that this book can say something big, right? And that's inevitable. So here you have, this is ideological, of course. I mean, I have a certain take on this environment that I'm part of and so forth, and this book could address that. And it was the same kind of process involved in translating the other book that I've done, which was this novel by Alberto Mussa. And the idea that this has to go into Arabic specifically, precisely in order to help establish that bridge between Brazil and Latin America in general, and the Arab world and to show that there is a Brazilian writer who is so interested in, Arabic poetry, pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, and it's all. So, and why is that? Because I felt that the Arab intellectual elite in general, our own cultural orientation has been for 2 centuries really toward Europe, France in particular, England secondarily, the United States now, and that there has to be an alternative for that if we're ever to kind of overcome what I think is our colonial mentality that we still live in, right? And so we do that by looking elsewhere, and I found that that Brazilian text is kind of a powerful example for what we can gain. But so again, it's a cultural translation. It's an ideological purpose there, and answers to another set of local concerns, which I think are concerns of our culture here, but not as felt by living here. But it was really out of my own location in the United States and the context of thinking about what comparative literature does and what it doesn't in the United States that made it for me a sort of a theoretical necessity for the Arab world to be in contact with. And hence that made me choose that. So there's a certain triangulation here that's very different from my thinking about translating leading from Arabic into English. Right? This was a different method, but I think it goes to illustrate this point that it's always local, answering to local concerns. It was also answering to my local concern in the United States to kind of be able to say that there is that connection between the Arab world and Latin America, and here it is, and you can help. It's definitely questions of identity. And it gets me, of course, to the fourth and final point here, which is there really is no categorical choice of strategy that can guarantee what Beirut calls, a good translation. I mean, he does present, and I don't know how much discussion of Beirut you've had. Is this something? Okay, so Lawrence Venuti is probably now the major theorist of translation, literary translation, in the United States. He's written several books, and one of the people really who helped make translation part of the conversation in literary studies. And he identifies two main strategies for translation. One of them he calls domestication, the other one foreignization. Okay? By domestication is a kind of translation that brings the text more toward the readers, okay? Familiarizes the text, tries to eliminate its foreignness, its strangeness, make it conform as much as possible to the preconceived notions of the audience. Right? Foreignization was the opposite. Right? Foreignization tries to challenge the readers by, in many ways, by writing in, say, non-idiomatic English, if you're translating into English, in order to kind of stretch, the language a little bit, by challenging the ideas that readers have about the other culture that you're translating from, right? And so on. So one way of putting it is domesticating translation brings the text to the readers. Foreignizing translation takes the readers more toward the text and the culture that it comes from. And he says that there are a whole host of ethical questions involved in both operations, and he opts for foreignizing translation that sort of estranges the text. It estranges the text and challenges the readers. And he says there is good translation and bad translation, beyond questions of language and accuracy and mastery of both and so forth. A good translation for him, and let me just, perhaps I can read that passage because I quote here from page 31 of the introduction to Humanities. It's a quote. He says, bad translation shapes toward a foreign culture a domestic attitude that is ethnocentric. Generally under the guise of transmissibility, it carries out a systematic engagement of the strangers of the foreign world. And it's quoting here Antoine Berman's Good translation aims to limit this ethnocentric engagement. It stages an opening, a dialogue, a cross-breeding, AD centric, and thereby forces the domestic language and culture to register the foreignness of the foreign text. So it's a question in the end about ethnocentrism. Is this a translation that reinforces ethnocentric attitudes toward the other culture and thereby also toward ourselves? Or is it a translation that challenges that ethnocentrism? And that's what is a good translation. And that's, of course, beyond question, right? This is an ethical problem, and it's also ideological in many ways. Now, when he opts for foreignization, as I go on to sort of cite some other people here, he thinks that this would guarantee a good translation. But as translators of Arabic literature into English have specifically pointed out, foreignization can actually do the opposite. Because there already is strong stereotyping of the Arab world. Okay? And there's already a powerful sense of unbridgeable otherness that separates Arab culture from European or American readers. So a foreignizing strategy will simply reinforce that, okay? And kind of contributes to that ethnocentric whereas a domesticating translation can do the opposite. Right? I mean, if the concern is with ethnocentrism, then we really have to think very carefully about what each strategy would do. And I would say, so settling on a simple choice like that is not going to guarantee a particular outcome. I mean, that's would be, I guess, the final point I want to emphasize here. That we constantly have to sort of, as we translate, have to be asking ourselves at every step of the way, what is being produced here, right? By these strategies that we may pick.
Great, thank you so much. I guess I'll start with a question about that, the foreignizing and the domesticating. Can you tell us how those played out in your own translation of Mussa? Because it's nice to think about these in a practical, and especially that his novel is a particularly interesting bridge, as you're saying, in reinforcing or opening the doors for the South-South dialogue. And the novel itself is really interesting because it's a quest for something that's never been there in the first place. And so that's also on a sort of meta level interesting in translation and bridging. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's much harder to translate dead authors than living authors with whom one can get in touch. So I consider myself lucky in that both authors I've translated are not only living, but also were very generous with their help. And they gave me a lot of input. So in the case of Alberto Mussa, I knew, because I met him before translating the book, and I knew that he wanted this novel to sound as if it were written in Arabic. That's how he put it. So, obviously it's a Brazilian novel. But he wanted to, as part of his own, because he felt this is, kind of way of reclaiming his own heritage. He's third generation Lebanese immigrant in Brazil and so forth. And he wanted this to be, and I thought, okay, this is probably doable insofar as the subject matter lends itself to it. This is a novel about Arabic poetry. It is populated by Arab poets, and there are a lot of quotations from pre-Islamic poetry, which kind of helps. So, of course, I don't translate the poetry. I just went to the originals and quoted the originals, and discovered, in fact, that his own translations in some cases, because he quotes them in his novel in Portuguese in his own translation. I found myself going back to him and say, all right, you render this like that, but I think I really have to go to the original, and there are these different versions of it, and this is what could work, and so forth. So that was that. But then in narration and in dialogue, I tried to make it sound as Arabic as possible, with very little estrangement. In other words, I was not going for estrangement here, of trying to stretch Arabic or make no. He wanted this to sound as Arabic as possible. I will try as much as I can to make it sound as Arabic as possible, as idiomatic as possible. So that's what I tried to accomplish with the narration and the dialogues. Of course, the dialogues had to be in classical Arabic. Because now, of course, as you know, a lot of Arab writers put the dialogues in a dialect or something. This was not an option here, because this is pre-Islamic Arabic. But there was actually, a detail where I felt needed to be changed. And there's one scene in the novel in which Batash, who's the main character in this novel, stops by a tent and people are drinking tea there. And the sort of 5th century type of cafe. And then I asked him, what do you mean by tea? This is the 5th century. The tea was brought by the British in the 19th century. And he said, well, I thought what we understand by tea is any kind of brew where you put leaves of some kind in hot water. It's like, all right, but earlier on you talk about coffee as being something that was invented, the drinking of coffee as something that was invented in Yemen. So why don't you say coffee instead of tea? And he thought, oh, I never thought of it. It would fit better, I think, in the context to say that he stopped by at that tent to drink coffee than to drink tea, having already. So he said, okay, yeah, please do that. And then in the next version of the novel, I would have to change tea to coffee. Okay, so that's as an example, because it's always a problem. What do you do when there's a mistake in the original text, or when there is, and translators will sometimes correct things, or think that they are correcting things, and change, or delete, or condense, or insert new things that weren't in the original, on the assumption that this improves the final product, and it can be very problematic. But in this particular case, and I wouldn't have done it, obviously, if I couldn't talk to him and check with him first to see what he meant by that, and whether that fitted with what I thought needed to be done. But if this was an author with whom I couldn't communicate, had this been a Norwegian or a Chinese or a Japanese author or somebody who died, as I probably would have left it tea as it is with. And have the reader wonder about it, the way I wondered about it.
When you're describing domestication versus colonization, one example actually from some texts that you worked on came to my mind, which is not exactly in the context of translation per se. It has of basically authors using untranslated words in their own basically works, in their own narratives. And basically, and the effect that this could have on the reader, who might then have to play the role of a translator within the reading process. What's your take on that, actually, on this kind of strategy that's used?
Could you give an example of using?
Yes, like in breaking poems. Suhail Hamad uses lots of terms, okay, such as wa habibi, sakran, words that really mama, yamma, and then basically she's like
Yeah.
These words sometimes they could be like thought of as maybe like occupying 1/3 of the space of the text.
Mm-hmm.
So the alienation versus domestication part then is also part of how we theorize the reading process, and not only the translation.
Yes. Yes, no, absolutely, and of course, Arab American poet writing in English was using all of these Arabic words, and which, of course, in the English poem have a certain effect. Partly is that linguistic estrangement, giving the readers words that they don't know, which are recognizably and clearly from another language. What do you do when you translate that poem into Arabic? That's a great example for this. The idea that one has to stop and think, what am I trying to accomplish here by translating this, and how do I accomplish that goal? Because it's obviously it's impossible to translate. And this is the moment of untranslatability. Maybe untranslatability is something also that I guess could have talked about now. But how does one confront the untranslatable? And the untranslatable here is not the Arabic word, but it's the switch in register from English to Arabic, and the effect that has on the reader who reads it in English.
Yeah, but also, when discussing it, we have this question of when we want to translate it into Arabic.
Yes.
Then how do you deal with those Arabic words?
Right.
Basically, in terms of context, exactly. This estrangement effect. How do you reproduce it if you are basically using the other context?
Right. Well, the question here, do you really? You may lose the estrangement effect, which is one big component of a poem like that. So if that estrangement effect cannot be transmitted into the translation, then what is the translation do? Okay? How do I, when she writes Habib, how do I translate that into Arabic? Well, I have to leave it at the same. So I can't translate it into English and put the English word in the middle of that. It would just, it would be nonsensical. So then, I guess the question then, why am I translating this poem? That would have to be the question, the initial question. And there can, of course, be a number of ways to answer. Why do you want to translate? What do I want to familiarize Arab readers with Palestinian American poet? If that is the goal, then maybe the estrangement is not something that I need. And then I can just sort of accept the fact that it's impossible to translate that. And then just move on then with the other things that I think are worth translating and pitch the translation in that way. Now, I happen to be in favor of footnotes. I know a lot of translators don't like that. But in footnotes, you can explain some things like that. Or if not footnotes necessarily because they ruin the look of the page, as some people argue. But I think it's always good to have a translator's introduction or afterward, where the translator explains their strategy, explains the context as much as possible of the original, and explains the choices that he or she has made to the reader. And I think if that is there, then it's okay. I think that mitigates that kind of question of fidelity.
I had an experience that sort of brought this issue to the fore when I took Juanes's play to New York and worked with Arab American actors and actors from the Arab world, Nada, and I had very consciously decided, dealing with precisely the question that Wail's talking about, that everything should be translated into English. And there were phrases such as Allahu Akbar and whatever that were in the text that, Nada and I would talk extensively about it. And I would say, well, when I was a boy growing up in Georgia, we would all say a prayer holding hands before lunch that began, God is great, God is good, whatever, These things are translatable, and the very idea of untranslatability, we decided was a very bizarre sort of wall between cultures, and therefore we, along then with the director, looked at Syria as one end of the Silk Road. It's part of Asia. And of course, anywhere along the Silk Road, Uzbekistan or what, there will be things that you don't know. But that you can make a full translation into English. So we translated everything and worked very hard. And then to the Arab American actors and the actors from the Arab world in a workshop in New York, because I showed them both the French translation of the play and the English translation of the play, began to try to reinsert the Arabic terms and insisting that they had a sort of talismanic value that you could not find any equivalent. And I would ask them, well, did you read the Brothers Karamazov in Russian? Or, it's true of every language. What is it particularly about Arabic that has this talismanic quality? Every language has untranslatable aspects. Why, and yet that's what translators do. And it was a real revelation to me. We had a really wonderful conversation, and I don't think that they changed their mind, nor did I, but it was a very interesting conversation. It was very much the sort of obverse of what you're talking about.
I mean, it's true. I mean, I'm of two minds about this. I mean, on the one hand, you have all of these everyday expressions. Almost all of them contain the word God or whatever in Arabic that people use, and you don't really hear it. It's part of everyday speech of almost any situation. But when you translate those literally all the way every time in English or in French or in pretty much any other language, they will have a very different ring. It just really overemphasize the aspect of religion. So on the one hand, you can say, yeah, well, that's sort of showing specificity and particularity, but it's also adding to that kind of exoticism and sense of otherness, and re-emphasizing the sense of otherness which already exists. And I think people do that consciously, for different reasons. Because they want precisely to capitalize on those stereotypes, but also in order to reclaim them. In a way, that's another sort of approach, but it ends up, who knows how it ends up working. So I mean, I can understand both arguments, and I think, again, one has to ask at every step of the way, what am I trying to accomplish here? And is this strategy helping me accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish? And I don't think it's a question that can be settled once and for all, really, even within the same one.
Well, it becomes very interesting with the question of things like a samovar, whether or not it's a particular, a cultural item, and you can infer that this is for making tea or whatever. That actually, I find that movement in translation fascinating, and therefore I think I come down clearly on the side of foreignness. There are some things that are for Bargashosa and Rabasa were working on the greenhouse in which there are a number of names for indigenous trees. And so Rabasa was told by Bargashosa, I don't want you to exoticize, this Peruvian Amazon. And so when he looked at the names of these trees, which were quite strange, he looked at the French translation to compare, and they all said, the arbre, the tree, which was one choice. And he opted and explained to Bargashosa that these are the names of the trees. Now, they were given these indigenous names, and for someone in Lima, they're also exotic, if you want, but that is the particular name of the tree, and therefore it would seem odd to try to domesticate it. So those sorts of conversations with a living author are incredibly, potentially productive. Pamuk, for example, sits with the English translator because he knows that all the other translators are going to translate from English. So the English translation is the one that matters because they're not going to translate from Turkish.
I have a question going back to the role of translation as the cross-cultural dialogue, but again, it entails decontextualization of the matters discussed. So how, like, what is lost there? Like, does that affect the dialogue? I mean, there are cultural, I don't know, like, there are things that in the decontextualization process are going to be lost. So how does this affect dialogue between culture, which is the primary aim of translating text?
Well, loss is inevitable. I mean, that's something we have to accept. Total fidelity is impossible. There are going to be losses, but there are also going to be gains. And so then the question is really, how do we compensate? I mean, what are we accomplishing when we translate? You cannot render that poem exactly as it is, or that whatever it is, or short story. Okay. So I think it's crucial that we're thinking very, very carefully, very critically about what it is that's happening to this text when we translate.
Well, would you address the liturgical aspect of Arabic and what role, if any, that plays in the fidelity question? Because it seems like, it emphasizes what is a particular problem in translation among many. And it's one that I know, I've seen people come back to repeatedly, is the fidelity question. And I wonder the extent to which it does or does not have to do with the fact that Arabic is a liturgical language. And the reason I ask is because, there are multiple translations of Madame Bovary, of Chekhov, of the idea that translation is a multiple process. I know this from being a playwright and directing, that there are probably 8 or 10 translations from Russian into English of The Cherry Orchard. And it's absolutely wonderful to look at various ones, since I don't speak Russian, but I'm a big fan of Chekhov. The idea of fidelity is pretty much out the window then, and I just wonder whether you think that's true, and if it is, particularly with Arabic, and is it related to that liturgical function?
I mean, it's true of any language. One thing, I like to do a lot when teaching poetry, also when teaching translation, is walk in the first, class with 6 or 7 different translations of the same poem by Wail, and have the students compare them. All right, assuming they're not even going with the original at all. I mean, some student may have read it in French or not, but just compare, these different. How this is the first verse or the first quatrain, whatever, rendered in all of these different versions, and the students come precisely to this conclusion, that it is all of them, each one of them is a different poem, ultimately. And what that shows, is that it's impossible to render the original faithfully, 100%. There's always going to be something lost in that sense. But that also each one of those translations is standing on its own, doing something else. Right? So the question becomes, well, what is the translation doing?
So you don't think there's any relationship between fidelity and say, the Quran being in Arabic, or language of God being Arabic, or the diacritical marks that tell you how to pronounce every word in the text in the same way, that might have something to do. I just wonder, because I've had multiple translation experiences in various languages and in Arabic repeatedly, and it may be a function of the fact that only now are people like Maya, really beginning to look at these translation questions and the problematic nature of translation in the Arab world. Or it may be my own misreading, but it seems to be a repeated question. The fidelity question, the untranslatability question seems to be right at the forefront, less so in other languages. It could be, for example, I've had more experience in Portuguese where people tend to be very colloquial, it's very fluid, it's more informal, but Spanish too. The fidelity question, too, is far less, key.
I think you run into it in any language. In any language. I mean, precisely even. I mean, that's a good example. And the kind of informality of Portuguese. Well, how do you run with that? I mean, when you have a change in register. So, I mean, I think the liturgical aspect you're pointing to, I mean, I would say that is a function of a certain register in Arabic. And, but it doesn't really make it any more or less untranslatable than any other register in Arabic or in any other language. I mean, in other words, one comes across this problem all the time in any kind of translational situation. And it is one of the things that one has to be aware of. But I don't think it's I don't think Arabic is exceptional in that sense.
But do you think that because you're a very sophisticated translator and a literary scholar, I'm not actually talking about people like you, I'm talking about people who are somewhat less familiar with translation and believe that fidelity is conceivable in this way. I gather from what you're saying that the idea of fidelity in any translation is something that, at the very least you bracket and say, well, a perfectly, a translation that, has perfect fidelity to simply is inconceivable.
Right, I mean, it's a myth. I mean, I think, taken literally, if by fidelity we mean that the translation will be identical in every way to the original, that's clearly impossible. Impossible to accomplish in any translation situation. Even between languages that are so close, I mean, take Spanish and Portuguese, for instance, and people can understand each other, each speaking even there, then we can, but however, I mean, we can talk about fidelity in different ways. And we can talk about fidelity in, not fidelity in the sense that everything can be transmitted, but I can ask myself, for instance, what are the intentions of this, or what is this text trying to do? And it's always going to be my understanding of what that text is going to do, which may have nothing to do with what the author wanted. Okay? And so in that sense, I mean, fidelity is just not going to be possible at all. Right? But I mean, I'd like to open up that question of fidelity to sort of interpretation, but I realize it's actually going to be at an end in the end. So I'd rather just sort of say that it's impossible once and for all, and let's concentrate on other things, rather than try and redefine it and say everyone can
I'd like to link it to something you said earlier when you said it's also the local concern that counts, because fidelity is one thing, but you have an interest also in the text. What do you want to do with it? So you gave the example that you were so interested in Quito because of the debate or world literature and comparative literature in the US at the moment. So that's a very different interest from the interest the author had. And I think we can compare it in a way to some museological practices, creating. I mean, when you take objects right? And you place them in different contexts, and when you look at some objects, how they've been put in different exhibitions, the same objects or in different museums, or within the same museum, how, you know, the way they're put on display has changed. And here also the question of fidelity comes in, and I think in recent, especially when it comes to archaeology, there's this trend to have more of the context, to be, you know, to provide background information, or to try, look at our museum here at LUB, where you have, you know, kind of a reconstruction, where you have some skulls and I don't know what, where they try to kind of reconstruct the site where the object was found in order to provide some more, you know, context, even though we are still, if you want, within the same, you know, cultural or geographical sphere. So I think it's somewhat comparable to that. Also the kind of liberty which makes translation interesting is that you, similar to, you know, a curator, you make these choices, like, you know, what's the context in which you place the text.
Yeah, try and make the context as you know, as clear as possible. And I think, and I agree with you. And I think, as a translator, the place to do that is an introduction or an afterword, or you know, where I just basically own up to what it is that I'm trying to do with this text, where it comes from, what it may or may not mean there, and why I'm doing what I'm doing with it, for what purpose. And I think just kind of doing that will just render this problem of authenticity really. Yeah, I think we'll just help avoid altogether.
But it's very much like artists who, some artists have a theory about what they're doing. I mean, William Weaver, for example, you know, who, say, translation of The Name of the Rose is really magnificent. There's no, it's just handed to you. And he has written essays subsequently and compared it to translating Moravia or Montali or whatever, and it's absolutely fascinating then. And I, of course, want to know, but then a lot of artists, if you ask them how they do it or why, and I think there are translators who intuitively are extraordinarily good at translating, and they don't really, the theory is the act of translation, and if you ask them to step outside, they can probably tell you something, and then there's some people who began with the theory and apply it.
Right.
But I love reading about the process of how they did it, but some are not very clear at all about saying what they're doing, but they're very good at it. Absolutely. I
mean, not everybody may be able to explain that process in that explicit theoretical way, but they're doing something that is, you know, clearly fascinating and pretty good. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just too much of a scholar, perhaps, dabbling with translation. And I mean, you know, a lot of the good translations that we read don't come with prefaces and introductions.
But I think in Robert's example, actually, I was wondering when you were describing the process, whether there's the affective component also. You said Arab American and Arab, basically, artists. So, you know, whenever you say it's not translatable, saying that the feeling also, this is like saying that the feeling that it produces in me as an artist cannot be translated. And this actually brings me to the next question, probably. Does it make a difference to translate from one's native language into another language, as opposed to basically translating between two languages that are not one's own? For you, for your experience as a translator.
Yeah, I think the standard thing is for people to translate into their native language, but that is assuming that their native language is the strongest language they have. Okay? In my case, I mean, I went to Arabic schools and everything, and all my education pre-university was Arabic. I don't think I have any problem with Arabic at all, but all my academic life has really been conducted translated in English. So translating into English was a lot, translating Khalito into English was a lot easier for me than translating Musa into Arabic. Because I had to come back and write for Arabic the first time in, I don't know, since I was 18 or 19, 7 years ago. Well, at the time, maybe 45, about 35 years ago. You know, and that maybe, I mean, that was part of the challenge too. I mean, how do I make this sound Arabic when I myself don't know how to sound Arabic enough, or what I'm saying is Arabic enough to read people who read it. You know, I don't know. I think. I guess people, you know, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to answer the question really. Except that I think it is perhaps, I mean, it was a risk, and I felt at the time that it was worth taking, because even though I don't normally translate into Arabic or even write into Arabic, there was nobody else to do it. So when I was in Cairo, and I was, you know, I just published that essay in Alif, the journal of comparative poetics, published at ABC, and I was sitting with some friends there who were saying, I mean, I was telling them somebody needs to translate this book into Arabic, and they were like, yes, but you have to do it because nobody else here translates from Portuguese. I was like, what do you mean? You have this National Center for Translation that, you know, is putting out hundreds of titles every year. Well, guess what? You know, the majority of these titles are translated from Arabic and English. They have, translated into Arabic from English and French, and then comes German, far behind, and with a trickle of Russian texts. We still have people translating from Russians from, you know, the 60s and so forth. And they have maybe one or two people who translate from Spanish. And that's it. They don't translate anything else. Simply because they don't have qualified translators. And they have made it a policy from the very beginning that they only do direct translation, not relay translation. So they have to have people working on the original translating into Arabic. So if I didn't do it, take that risk, which to me was a stretch with you know, my Arabic, nobody was going to translate the book. So then I had to do it. And I had to rely, of course, a lot on, I hired a couple of people to go over my manuscript before I submitted it to the publisher, which of course they had their own copy editors as well, just to make sure that, you know, at least I'm presenting something. So that was a risk that I had to take, because that I would not have taken. I mean, you know, under any other circumstance. I mean, I didn't, you know, try and translate something from English into Arabic or French into Arabic. Why should I do it when there are so many people who have been doing this for a long time? Right? So I would say, I mean, for me, the most comfortable thing is to translate into English. But now, having done the Arabic once, I mean, if something else comes along, especially from Portuguese, which is the language that's really not being translated from at this time, then I might do it. But I think definitely, I mean, one has to. I mean, there's a certain responsibility there too. One has to kind of be sure that I am really in command of this idiom as much as anybody can be in command of any idiom, to be able to translate responsibly. So, and for most people, that's usually the native language.
I have a question. When you were translating into Arabic, did you find yourself veering more towards domesticating the text or foreignizing it?
Well, it was my goal to domesticate.
Okay.
And that the reason for that is that I knew Alberto wanted this to sound as Arabic as possible. So that was my, you know, goal from the beginning. And even when I gave it to the copy editors that I hired, I said, tell me if there's anything here that sounds translated, because I need to fix that.
But doesn't it run the risk, though, of becoming or reinforcing ethnocentricity?
It does, Except that in this situation, there was really very little ethnocentricity to work with, because I felt nobody knows anything about Brazilian literature. The only thing that, I mean, the stereotypes of Brazil that exist in the Arab world are pretty much the stereotypes of Brazil that exist in North America. Soccer, you know, beaches, that sort of thing, right? Samba, okay? So something else, something that is so radically different from that, like a Brazilian novel about pre-Islamic poetry, that already flies in the face of any kind of stereotypes that readers, that I don't have to do anything on my part as a translator to defend. So the text was by itself already countering these stereotypes. So in that case, I didn't need to estrange anything. On the contrary, I mean, let me try and accomplish what the author wanted, because that in fact is in line with what I was hoping for would accomplish. But that's what I needed in every situation. I mean, there's no strategy that a priori can guarantee anything. One has to think about it case by case and even page by page. So there, the main strategy was domestication for these reasons, and then I had to make sure that at every turn I was actually being consistent with, not with necessarily, you know, I mean, with just the goals that this book tries to accomplish.
I guess as a final and wrap up, I think if you could, I was very interested in the article, and I wish we had more time so we can talk about it a little bit more in terms of, so now we've spoken about translation practically from the practice of it, you practicing it, but now if we want to extrapolate it to a sort of a meta-theoretical approach in starting a South-South dialogue, as you're doing, I believe, in this book, right, that you're working on now. Would you say then, that in this particular context, and if we want to hold on to difference, right? If we want to counter some of the problems of subaltern studies, and we really want to sort of make difference act as difference and be difference and hold on to that without really sanctifying it, or, I mean, these are all very difficult questions that we're asking in our class this semester. How do you do something like that, and can you do it? So one interesting perspective is that the Mussa novel itself sort of doesn't fall prey to those, I mean, resists them because it doesn't, you know, work within certain stereotypes, or, but could we think of this perhaps on a more sort of backing out and theoretically conceiving of this as translation as a way of imagining a South-South dialogue? And if it's possible, then do you understand where I'm going with this? It's a bit complicated in my head, but just as a framework, really. So translation as a way of reading and as a framework of thinking, and bringing together, you know, moving beyond Orientalism, which you were doing in your lecture, because we need to move beyond it. And one way to move beyond it, perhaps, is to...
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think world literature wouldn't exist without translation. Well, whatever we understand by world literature, it just doesn't happen except in translation. Because, I mean, each one of us can learn how many languages? Right? 2, 3, 4, 5, a dozen maximum, right? So, and that's not world literature. So world literature is a text that travels in translation. So translation is really essential here, as it has been essential in the humanities. I mean, the humanities as large wouldn't exist without translation. Right? So translation is always crucial, and it's crucial, especially obviously when we're talking about making these bridges between cultures that are not normally seen to be in contact or touch. So it's a question, but then you run into these kind of institutional hurdles that that I just alluded to. I mean, something like a National Center for Translation, it's government organs, all of these tens of billions of pounds being put into it, and they don't have a translator from Portuguese. So this is a function, of course, it's not a fault of the center, obviously, but I mean, they are drawing on the resources, and these resources are provided by the universities, and the universities are training these people, and their universities are responding to needs that exist or perceived to exist, and they have histories. Okay? I mean, there are institutional histories for why these universities are the way they are, and they offer what they offer. So, and this is all part of the story. So you know, why is this novel not being translated into Arabic? I mean, it's a much, much bigger question. And I think, and even in the United States, I mean, one of the questions that I've been thinking about for a very long time, one of the reasons why I got interested in Kalito is how do people compare, when they talk about comparative literature? How do comparative literature departments train comparatists? When I went there as a graduate student in 1990 and met with my advisor for the first time, I went to the BA, MA in English and so forth, and I knew French, and I wanted to do Arabic, I wanted to do English and French and so forth, and my advisor said, what about Arabic? And I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, Arabic is there, it has to be. And of course, what happened eventually is that I wrote a dissertation about an Arab writer, and I began to define myself as an Arabist. But that was not by coincidence. It was because I was in the United States, and this is what they saw as being interesting in my background and in my profile, even though it's not what I intended or even wanted or knew I could do. But I fitted within a certain configuration that they had in mind. And at a particular time, of course, if I had gone 5 years earlier, this wouldn't have happened, it would be accepted. But at that point, Arabic had appeared on the radar screen, and it's like, oh, we should have somebody, even though they didn't have faculty teaching in, doing Arabic. But they said, this is something we need to do at this point, right? And the rest, and that's how, look at, so you look at how these programs are configured and the patterns of comparison that emerge from them. If you're doing Arabic, chances are you're also reading it in relation to English and French literatures, right? You're not doing Arabic and German and Russian, even though that's a perfectly conceivable combination. Why not? Nobody's trained that.
Maybe not in the US. In Germany, I don't think.
In Germany, yes. But it's not done that way, You don't do Arabic and Chinese. There's only one person that I know of in the world who does that, and it's a function of her family background and the way she was raised and so forth. And again, maybe 30 years ago, it would have been conceivable for someone like that to have a career, right? So when we're not talking about Arabic and Portuguese or Spanish, nobody's trained that way in comparative literature departments. And so the question that I've been talking about and writing about in discussions about comparative literature is why that is conceivable intellectually, but not done institutionally. Okay, there are histories to that. There are history, it's not by coincidence that English or French are dominant here. I mean, there's the history of the European empires is behind that. And there's also a reason why people working on, say, pre-modern Arabic literature are not necessarily reading Arabic in relation, they're reading Arabic in relation to Persian and Turkish, right? Not English and French. English and French weren't relevant back in the 10th century, didn't exist, in fact, in the 10th or 11th, 12th centuries. So then, as another consequence of that is that you have the schizophrenic split within the Arabic field itself. There are people who do classical with different configuration of languages, different approaches, different methodologies, different departments, and the people who are doing modern Arabic coming out of a completely different institutional context that is shaping them in a different way. And so you have then almost two disciplines within, it's a kind of a split that is not replicated in, say, in the field of French. If you're doing medieval French or to modern French, you're still in the same department, Foucault will be relevant, but not so in Arabic. Yeah. So this is all a function of the institutional context and institutional histories in which these things are studied.
Okay, I think we are out of time because he has to walk to the hotel. Thank you so much for
Thank you very much.
this and for coming to visit us.